We want to make sure that all have been served before we begin. I remember my first kiss. It wasn't Becky. It was so romantic. I was in 7th grade, by an outhouse. I was on a canoe trip, youth canoe trip. I was kind of peer pressured into it. I don't remember the girl's name, but we were by the outhouse. Isn't that so romantic? So nervous, and it was probably the most pathetic looking thing you could see. But that was my first kiss. My first girlfriend. So get this, my first kiss, that first real kiss, 7th grade. My first girlfriend was 6th grade. That went real well, didn't it? Erica, I remember my first girlfriend walking her to class in middle school, just Twitter-pated, Just, there's Erica Stevens, still remember her name. We're Facebook friends, by the way. Good friend. My first love was Becky. And I'm not just saying that because she's here. My first love was Becky. The first one I really fell in love with. My first one that I was like, this is the one. It wasn't love at first sight, but the first one that I really had that love for was Becky. We remember those emotions, those feelings, those loves. You remember your first kiss? You remember your first girlfriend, boyfriend? You remember your first love? It's a powerful thing. It's a powerful feeling, a powerful emotion that we as Americans, I think not just Americans, we as people love to love. We love that feeling. We love that emotion. Valentine's Day is the 3rd highest holiday that we spend money on, behind Christmas and Halloween, of all things. We spend more money on Halloween. Now, maybe we have to scare the people we love. I don't know. But we spend, as Americans, $24 billion on Valentine's Day. $24 billion we spend on Valentine's Day. That's more than GDP than most of the countries of the world that we spend on Valentine's Day. On average, you take that, you average that out, and it averages out to about $193 per person that we spend on Valentine's Day. Just an insane amount of money that we spend to express love and affection to somebody else. Crazy amount, crazy number, crazy things that we do for love, crazy things that we say, places that we go for love. Jesus does the same thing for us. We're beginning to wrap up the series, and as the series Live the Life of a Follower of Jesus, what it means and how we actually live this life, I think we might extend it a little bit. You have in your bulletins those inserts that you can fill out. If you have a question that you've ever had or questions you've ever been asked, you can fill those out. You can give to me. You can drop them in the offering box. You can give them to somebody. And we're going to do a series following this on that, but I think I'm going to delay that by a week or two to finish this series up. But this live the life of love. All these things that we do, and I think we have a twisted view of what love is, mostly, of being driven by affection versus driven by choice or real genuine heart of, I care for you. I like the fact that Jesus says we are to love people. He doesn't command us to like people. Because there are people we don't like. There are people that we may not get along with. I look at the disciples and I look at what a dysfunctional group they were. And there's probably some of those disciples that maybe Jesus didn't necessarily like a lot. Judas was probably one of them. I'm sure Peter drove him nuts. I know he did. I'm not sure Jesus loved or really liked the Pharisees all the time. I'm sure he didn't like some of the stuff that happened, but he loved people deeply and affectionately and passionately. But Jesus has this command, this interaction happens in the last couple hours of Jesus' life in John chapter 13. In John chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. It's in the upper room. Jesus is in 10, 12 hours or so of his death. He just washes the disciples' feet. He just serves them in this beautiful way. And then he says this in John chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. Again, get your Bibles out, get your phone app out, have your pen, paper ready, because there's a couple things in here I think you're probably going to want to note. You're going to want to highlight, make some notes on. John chapter 13, 31 through 35, it records this. As soon as Judas left the room. If you have your pen, you can underline that. There's a timing thing. There's an importance thing here. As soon as Judas left the room, Jesus said, "The time has come for the Son of Man to enter into his glory, and God will be glorified because of him. And since God receives glory because of the Son, he will soon give glory to the Son. Dear children, I will be with you only a little longer. And as I told the Jewish leaders, you will search for me, but you can't come where I'm going. So now I am giving you a new commandment." I'm going to hold it right there for a second. So here is Jesus within hours of his death. He's within hours of his death. He's been with them for 3.5 years, right? He spent all this time with them. He's taught them all of these things. He's invested in them. In John chapter 17, he's going to pray in just a little bit. So we're in chapter 13. You go to John chapter 17, and as he's praying, he says this really interesting phrase. He says, "Lord, I have completed the work you gave me to do." He hasn't died yet. And he prays, I have completed the work you have given me to do. So all this is happening, and I'm sure the disciples' heads are spinning at this point because they know the situation is dire. They know that Judas just left. They don't understand what he's doing, that maybe it has something to do with Passover. Maybe it has something to do with the meal. Maybe it has something to do with the celebration. Maybe he has to go to the bathroom. They don't know what he's doing, but he gets up and he leaves. And Jesus says this thing where after 3.5 years, he's facing death, and he says, "I'm giving you something new." Like, oh, wait a second. All the things that you've taught us, here in the last, you're giving us something new? Like, come on. Really? I mean, we're having a hard time remembering everything else that you've told us over the last 3.5 years, and you're telling us something new on top of all the other stuff? I mean, you boiled it down to 2 commands, right? Before this, he boiled it down to 2, love God, love people. Now there's a new one? Like, Jesus, seriously? So here is this new command. If you have your pen, you need to underline that. I am leaving you a new command. I'm giving you something new. I don't know if the disciples were on the edge of their seats or not. They should have been, and so should we. So now, verse 34, so now I am giving you a new command. Love each other. Just as I have loved you, you should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. I'm sure the disciples were kind of like scratching their heads a little bit. Jesus, you've talked about love before, and you've talked about this before, and you said love God, love people. How is this new? When you look at the context of this story, and you look at the context of this sitting in this situation, Jesus is talking to them, and what would the disciples be thinking about? If I'm giving you a new command, and I want you to love other people the way that I have loved you, what would they be thinking? In this moment, when we look back and we see this text and we read this, we think of the cross. We think of communion. We think of forgiveness. We think of the fact that Jesus went to the cross, suffered, died, was resurrected again, that proved his love for us. What would the disciples have been thinking in this moment? They'd have been thinking about the last 3.5 years. So as Jesus is saying, hey, Peter, hey, Bartholomew, hey, John, hey, Andrew, hey, how have I loved you over the last 3.5 years? Well, Peter's thinking about his mother-in-law being healed. The disciples are probably thinking about the time they were rescued in the boat when the waves were crashing over the boat, and Jesus walked out and Jesus rescued them and Jesus served them. They're probably thinking about the foot washing that just happened. They're probably thinking about just the way that they were changed and the way that their lives have been transformed over the last years. They're probably thinking about how Jesus fed them. They're probably thinking about how Jesus gave them nourishment. They're probably thinking about the times around the campfire that they were talking and laughing and having a good time, and how Jesus took care of them, how he loved them, how he accepted them, how he brought them together. These guys were literally, not hyperbole, they were enemies before Jesus got to them. They hated each other. You have Matthew, a tax collector. I mean, you all know the story. You've been around church very much. You know, tax collectors were hated people. They were IRS agents times 10. Had the freedom to cheat and steal. So you had the tax collector, a Jew, who was probably hated by everybody in the group. You have Simon the Zealot. Zealots were insurrectionists. A lot of times, zealots would carry knives up their sleeves. They would have knives under their robes, and they believed in violence. So Simon the Zealot, it's possible that he was a murderer. He believed in a violent overthrow of the Roman government. Doesn't sound unlike today in some places, does it? You have these fishermen who were kind of the outcasts of society. Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, these fishermen, outcasts of society. You have Matthew, who's wealthy, but is hated by everybody. Yeah, some of these other guys, we don't know what they were necessarily. We don't know necessarily what they did and how. But you have this group of guys who literally, when they came together, hated each other. And Jesus is saying, as I have loved you, love one another. The way that I served you equally, the things that we did, the things you saw me do, how I served you, this is how I want you to serve one another. Let's go back and look at the verses. So, verse 34. So now I am giving you a new command. If you have your pen, just write a little V over that love, because this is the verb form of love. Agapao. It's the verb form. Verb is action, right? I'm not very smart, but I know a few things, and verb is an action. And Jesus is saying, love one another. Action. Serve one another. Do one to one another as I have done. Just as I have done, you must do to one another. You must have this action towards one another. It's not just one way that I do it to you and you do it to me because you like me and I like you and I love you and you love me, and there's this a symbiotic relationship that we have with one another, that we like this person and we love this person. Now Jesus is saying, it's not just me. It's you. You got to love one another. You got to have this action towards one another. Just as I have done it to you, you've got to do it to each other. So verb, love each other just as, exactly the same. So as I provided your needs, you provide for one another's needs. As I gave myself for you, you give yourself for one another. As I provided safety, you give safety. As I gave nourishment, you give nourishment. All these things that Jesus did, just as I did, you guys got to do it to each other. Verb. Just as I have loved you. Put another V there. That's another verb form. Just as I have demonstrated my love for you. Just as I have shown you my love and given you my love over the last 3 years. Exactly the same action. You should, again, verb form of love, do it to each other. So Jesus is driving home the point of, you guys have to love and serve one another. You have to display it. You have to show it. It's not just a Valentine's card that you send. It's not just a, love you, man. Love you, dude. And we go our separate ways. Oh, I'm really sorry you're going through that. Oh, I'm really sorry your brakes are shot on your car. Man, that stinks. Hope you can pay for it. Jesus is saying, change the brakes. They got a donut tire on their car. Fix your tire. This is practical, real-world stuff that Jesus is commanding. How do I know that? Because that's exactly what Jesus did for him. It's exactly the same thing. Now, no, Jesus didn't change tires. They didn't have tires. But how can you show love for one another? Do it. Don't just say it. That's what Jesus is saying here. Then he says this, your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. This is a noun form. This is a noun form that he uses, agape. Probably heard it, agape. It's pronounced agape. Who you are, your essence, the reality of your nature for one another. That it's not just something, well, I gotta do this. It's something that comes out of and flows out of who we are. Because we have been transformed and changed by his love. He's made us different. You go back 3.5 years and these guys, their nature wasn't love. Their nature was hatred. Their nature was anger. Their nature was survival. Their nature was selfish. That's who they were. But over the last 3.5 years that Jesus has been with them, he has changed their nature and says, who you are, love. And this is powerful. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. The love that we have for one another is evangelistic. When he talked to the disciples and he said, he didn't tell them that how you're going to change the world, how the world is going to know that you're a Christian, how the world is going to know that you're a follower of Jesus. He didn't tell them it's going to be by your theology. He didn't tell them it's going to be by the church that you attend. He didn't tell them it's going to be how often you go to church. He didn't tell them it's how much you tithe or what you tithe. What he told them is the entire world will know that you are my disciples by who you are, your love for one another. Not even your love for me, Jesus, your vertical. Your love for one another is how the world's going to know that you're my disciples. It was this love that brought down the Roman Empire. It was this love that stopped the gladiators in the Colosseum and in the arenas. It was this love that transformed an entire world, literally. And it was because they loved one another. This is a new command. This is something totally revolutionary and radical to these guys. Murders, like I said a couple of weeks ago, the guy went out and choked the other servant that owed him money. It was legally okay to do that. You could go choke somebody who owed you money, and you could have them abused, and you could have them tortured. There was all kinds of legal things that you could do. He said, no, it's how you love one another. And he's talking to his disciples. He's talking to the church. Saying, church, you want to change the world? You want the world to know that you're my disciples? You want the world to know that you're my follower? You want the world to know that you're a Christian? You love one another. He's talking to the people in the same room. Everybody looking at Matthew. Love you, man. Love you. You were a tax collector, but now you're a follower of Jesus and you're a disciple. I love you. And these guys went to war together. They went at each other and then for each other. And I look at why our world is the condition that it's in, and I have this theory: it's because we don't do this as a church. The world will know that we are His disciples if we love one another. Does the world know that we are His disciples? Does the world know that you are a Christian? Does the world know that you are a follower of Jesus? By who you are, your nature has been changed, and the fact that you are loving one another that you don't like very much. You want to live the life of a follower of Jesus? How are you doing at loving your brother and sister? How are you doing at loving the people in this room? How are you doing at loving the people? Verb form, how are you doing at loving the people that you sit around the table with? How are you doing with the people that we just sang songs in this room together, but you look across the room and maybe there's some bitterness. Maybe there's some anger. Our love for one another is what defines us as His disciples. And the word that he uses here, just as this is how, it's a singular thing. It's a singular word. People want to know you're a follower of Jesus, you got to love each other. Pure and simple. It's not about theology. It's not about church attendance. It's not about tithing. It's not about any of this kind of stuff. Because Jesus could have talked about all of that. He could have talked about obedience to the law. He could have talked about how closely you follow the law or the new law. He could have talked about your attending temple. He could have talked about the sacrifice system. He could have talked about any of that stuff. He hasn't died yet. What he said will define you as a follower of Christ, and how people will know that you are living the life of a follower of Jesus is by how you love each other. That's how others will know that we're a disciple of Jesus. How are you doing, church? If we were to take your Facebook pages and we're to put your Facebook page up on the TV, the last tweet you shared, are people going to know that you love other people? Or are people going to see some anger? They're going to see some bitterness? They're going to see some rage? Or are they going to look at your Facebook page? They're going to look at the notes that you sent, whatever, signs in your yard? Are they going to know that you're a disciple of Jesus? Because they're going to say, oh, that person loves Jesus. Or will we be defined where people know more that we have an R by our name or a D by our name by our Facebook page? Because I can go back and I can look at those disciples and I can think, man, they were just as divided as the R's and the D's are today. They hated each other. Hated each other. But because Jesus changed their nature after spending time with Him, they loved each other. And it was that motivation, it was that relationship they had with one another that literally changed the world and drove them out to serve the people that they hated the most. You have Jews going to Gentiles. You have Jesus loving a prostitute. You have Jesus loving the people that hated Him. Church, we need to be doing the same thing. We need to be doing the same thing. That is what's going to define us as a church. And I'm not talking about capital C church, I'm talking about Blue Water. If we want to be different, if we want to change our community, 12 people changed the world simply by loving each other. What can we do to Kimball Township, to Port Huron, to St. Clair County if we simply start loving one another and serving one another and sacrificing for one another and stop being offended at everything? Stop having our feelings hurt. And stop getting worked up over the littlest and smallest things. Instead, love one another. We're going to close the service with a song. I don't know what we're singing, but church, we need to be better. If we're going to live the life of a follower of Jesus, do we have a verb form of love for our fellow man? Because we can get to heaven and we can say, oh, Jesus, I love you. And he's going to say, I know, but how did you love the person sitting next to you in church? How'd you do with that? Has he changed our nature? Has he changed your nature? Are you known by how you love people? Let's stand together and sing.